Thanks, Li-Ming. And hopefully you guys are seeing my screen now. All right. Well, it's always a pleasure to be at OMUG. I have learned so much from this group over the years, and it's always fun to find ourselves on the agenda. And I think we've got a fun one for you and a fun version of this presentation for us. And my colleague here at Metro, Peter Bosa, is joining me. And so what we want to talk about today is how we modeled a new measure of throughway performance for Metro's updated regional mobility plan. And for this group, we've done a number of presentations around the policy development side of this work, but we wanted to really focus in a little more closely on the data and modeling that it took to support this more flexible way of measuring our plan's performance. So just to overview what I'm going to talk about, so we have developed this new speed-based highway performance measure, a bit of a departure from the past, and it's actually part of a kind of a package of regional mobility policy measures. It's not the only criteria or even the dominant one, but it's the one that is really depends on the travel model and other data for support. So I thought it'd be of interest to this group and those that working in that area. Another thing that makes this work sort of fascinating is that it's one of the first times that we've done a real fusion, a melding of big data sources via INRIC's speed data and travel model outputs. And I think my view is increasingly this is going to be the direction we're going as modelers supporting planning and policy. That that the cheerleaders of big data were often making the push that it was going to replace our kind of old, outdated ways. But the reality is that they provide two different sets of tools usually, and often one is more suited to one thing than the other. And I think more often we're going to find ourselves kind of triangulating and fusing data sources and our travel model outputs. And this is a great example of that. And we really wrestled with it for quite a while to figure out how to make best use of both. And then finally, just I always think that models need exercise. If you keep them locked away just like a person and they don't get out and about, they tend to get stale and accumulate issues that you're not aware of. And so it's always good to stretch the model a little. This is a use case we hadn't really had before. And you learn a lot about the model, and we try to feed that back into our model development plan to make improvements. It's just great information that it gives you when you try a new application. So for those unfamiliar, and I think most of you in this room are probably vaguely familiar with the old way of measuring regional mobility, which was pretty closely based on volume to capacity ratios. It's about kind of right-sizing the system, and it as the RTP updates, especially in the metro region, went on, it was less and less a useful tool for measuring progress. It was just too narrow in focus. It wasn't multimodal explicitly. It was too blunt of an instrument, and honestly, as you see with these RTP targets that were not being met toward the end, it was just like it was like a gauge on your dash that's pegged at the top, and at that point it's not really providing you information about which direction you're heading. It just sort of says pull over now, and that wasn't. Yeah, that is an example of a performance measure that's not performing well, frankly. So, and I don't want to minimize the huge process. This was multiple years, 2 or 3 years of background research, stakeholder input, public outreach on developing this plan, and so a lot of thought went into this. This wasn't just us, playing around with what we could do with the model. We were really in a supporting role here, but you can see, from volume to capacity ratios to this mobility policy, that's a big leap. And what I'm going to be talking about today is just one sort of leg of this new mobility policy, which is meant to be much more holistic and better match measures to policies and goals. And the one I'm going to be focusing on is the fourth one on that list. I'll give you a link later for those of you that are interested in other parts of the mobility policy and maybe haven't been as closely attached. But we're focused on this measure of maintaining reliability, quote unquote, on the region's throughways. And obviously, it sounds easy to someone who doesn't work in this arena. For those of you that do, you know that little phrase is fraught with lots of options and challenges to get to that point. And so the three major bins here, again, so the primary target or policy measure is VMT per capita. And there are secondary measures on system completeness and this reliability of throughways measure, which I'm going to be talking about. And these secondary measures are really they're not used so much for target setting that we're going to maintain a certain level, but they're used as a better way, like I said, to give us a gauge of where we have the most needs and opportunities for improvement in the system, knowing that we can't do everything given funding and other realities. Where should we focus our attention, or where do opportunities exist to really to make a difference with scarce resources? And so in this reliability of throughways threshold, I'll tell you a little more about how those throughways are defined in a bit. But the threshold that was established, and this was in close coordination with our friends at ODOT, and like I said, a lot of research and input, was 4 or fewer hours per day that average throughway speeds drop below 35 for controlled access like freeway, or 20 miles an hour for a signalized arterial or other route in the region. And the idea here is related to the old goal, which was providing reliable travel speeds, for outside of the peak periods for goods and people to move. So that's there's an accession here. We recognize that we're not going to be able to meet level of service whatever necessarily throughout the region, but we want to do our best to make it as efficient as possible, and particularly as reliable as possible, so that there are hours of the day where traffic is moving with stable flows, and you can have an expectation of how long something's going to take. So how did we do it? And this is where we realized we needed to merge some data sources if we wanted to do the best job we could, because like I said, we're stretching the model a little bit. The model, a regional travel model, obviously is not, its primary design is not to get speeds on an individual facility at a given hour of the day, right? That's a stretch. So we wanted to bring in some observed speed data to kind of give us more of a grounding in reality. So step one, of course, is defining what we're looking at, what we're measuring, and where we're measuring it, defining the throughways, and that's defined through our regional transportation plan process. From that, though, we did needed to segment it, because these throughway corridors are really long, and there's a lot of variation within them on how the traffic flows. We had to create analysis segments, and then fuse these two data sources, and the two sources were observed speed data from INRIX, provided by ODOT via the RIDIS platform. I know some of you are familiar with that. But of course, that only gives you what's happening right now. You can't go into INRIX and query 2030 or 2045. And so we also needed to blend in regional model estimates of how those congested hours a day might change from a base year to a future scenario. And so blending those two together, we get a sense of current performance relative to this new reliability metric, and also projected performance in the future. So like I said, the RTP policy designates what the throughways are, and there are two big bins, as I mentioned. You'll see in the blue are the controlled access, mostly freeways in the Portland metro region, and the lighter, the pink color there are the signalized throughways that have driveway access along the way and signals that break up the flow of traffic. The observed data, that's the probe data, for those of you not familiar with it, from provided via NRIX, and it's attached to his own network, right? Not to our planning network, of course. It comes on this kind of Byzantine traffic messaging channel network, the TMC network, that has its breakpoints based on where, like a navigation system would want to tell you to heads up for an exit coming up or something like that. But it's not the same as a modeling network for sure. You can see the kind of oddly spaced breakpoints here. This is I-84 east and westbound near downtown Portland. And this is kind of what it looks like for single one of those TMC links. So this is one of those I-84 links I just showed. And over the course of a year, we looked at all non-holiday weekdays at 15-minute interval VINs. There's some data unavailability. And, that leaves you with the question, well, here's your data, but how do we translate that into this performance metric, which is how many hours per day is this link below this threshold? And you can see it's got to vary day to day, right? Sometimes in an hourly bin, traffic is moving along above the 35 mile per hour threshold. Some days it's below. Sometimes it's about a 50-50 split. We have to kind of define a metric to summarize that. And so we ended up calculating just the average weekday hours under the speed threshold for each of those TMC links. But the links still need to be aggregated for analysis. This is this was seen as too fine-grained and also subject to quite a bit of missing data in the probe data, and also getting to be well below, I would say, the model's sort of threshold for being able to define speeds on a segment. So at first, we started from the simple one, which was just freeway, the regional throughway definition, but these are very long, right? So that takes that and summarizes it basically all the way from 205 to the junction with I-5 on east of downtown, and you would get a single metric by doing a weighted average of those hours under the speed threshold. And in this case, westbound was not meeting the threshold. It was over 4 hours a day. Eastbound was, but that masks obviously a lot of variation along the way. So we worked with ODOT and with our consultant partners at DKS, and we tested a pretty good list of different strategies to segment the network for analysis. And in the end, we settled on a pretty simple one that was understandable, seemed defensible, and wouldn't require us to do too much tweaking over time. And that was just to go off-ramp to off-ramp for the controlled access freeway facilities. It sort of makes some logical sense that those define analysis segments. On the signalized throughways where you don't have ramps, then we typically would go major intersection to major intersection, but as I'll mention later, it's still kind of a process under development for those without access control. It's a challenge to normalize them. They're so locally dependent. So finally, to the punchline here. So how did we meld these sources together? Well, we took those analysis segments. We looked at the observed hours from the probe data not meeting policy, and then we adjusted that by the model's prediction of how that was going to change between the scenario and the base year. So as an example, you can see there from the probe data, we saw 3 hours per day not meeting the speed threshold. Between the 2030 no build and that base year in the model, the model was predicting an additional 2 hours a day that would not be meeting the threshold. So combining in a way the observed probe data and the model delta or change in conditions, we get our best projection of what we think the hours a day would be under that future scenario. So 2030 no build be 5 hours. The 3 we're observing now plus the 2 the model thinks are going to be added over that time, and that's our future projection. It would not be meeting our 4-hour threshold. And I'm going to hand it over to Peter for a few minutes here to just tell you, kind of take you slightly under the hood of the model and why this is a little bit of a challenge for the model, and why we
continued to use the big data where we could.
Great, thank you, Joe. Oh, Joe, I'm getting a bit of feedback up there. Perfect. So yeah, I'll just spend a few slides talking about some of the issues that we run into when we take very high resolution data like the INRIX data, high in both temporal and spatial resolution, and we try to match that with something like our model for our forecasted model data, which is much lower resolution, both temporally and spatially. So because this is a regional analysis, we had to use our regional modeling tools. And our primary workhorse is the Regional Travel Demand Model, RTDM. It's a standard four-step aggregate trip-based model. There's kind of a diagram on the left here of how those models, the various steps of those models work. But the key thing is that the final assignments are static assignments, static aggregated assignments. And this same analysis could be done with a more detailed, higher resolution, like microsimulation or mesoscopic simulation, but that's not practical at the RTP regional level. So we're working with static assignments. Next slide. Joe? Great. So what are some of the, I'm talking about the static assignment, but we refer to it as part of our regional travel demand model. So I'm just going to refer to it as regional travel demand model, but really this is specific to the static assignments that are part of that model. So some of the limitations of the model. They only assign trips to whole hours. So all of our assignment periods are for an entire hour. And they're for the whole hour, so noon to 1. It's impossible, or it's not. We don't currently do modeling like 12:30 to 1:30 or 12:15 to 1:15. We're set up in whole hour slots, 1 hour for every 24 hours of the day. And essentially we end up with averages for that hour for the entire link or segment that we're looking at. And so this makes it difficult to capture congestion that might occur over multiple time bins. And so, for example, if you have congestion that occurs in real life or in the INREX data between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m., the regional model the static assignments might show 2 hours of congestion from 5 to 6 and 6 to 7, or it might show 1 hour of congestion, either 5 to 6 or 6 to 7, or it may show 0 hours of congestion. So this is a disconnect that we often have with you relying on these more aggregate tools. Next slide. This is more of a comparison of some of the temporal and spatial limitations of the regional model compared to the INREX data. So if you look at this this diagram, we have kind of a sample, an example of a freeway, a throughway section broken into 3 segments. And we have examples from both observed or the INREX data and our model static assignment results. Just assume that the blank space means that traffic is flowing at or above that threshold speed. And if it's red, yellow, or orange, it means you're below that threshold speed. What you can see here is that in the observed data, we're able to capture the queue that begins in hour 1 at the output end of segment 1. And as you progress through hour 1 into hour 2, you can see that queue spilling back. And eventually by the end of hour 2 into the beginning of hour 3, it's spilled back to a secondary queue that's beginning to form at segment 3. And segment 3 has its very similar form as segment 1. It just happens a little later in the day. If we move to the second part of this diagram, we show the model data. So here's where the limitations really start to stand out. In segment 1, because we're capturing congestion, you're either above the threshold or below the threshold. It's kind of binary. By hour, the model data showing 3 hours of congestion relative to 3.5 hours that were observed. We move into segment 2. Another limitation of static assignments is that they don't do a very good job of capturing congestion due to queuing effects. So the upstream queuing that would eventually spill back into segment 2 is not necessarily captured in our static assignment. So in segment 2, we show 0 hours of congestion through the static assignment. And then segment 3, we come up with 2 hours of congestion, which is very similar to the observed, but you can see the pattern is a little bit different than what we see in the observed. So what this leads us to is that the model can underestimate congestion related to bottlenecks and may have different temporal distributions of that congestion. And yes, so this is an example in the real world of where we notice this. So this is I-5 northbound. This is south of the interstate bridge crossing. And it's certainly an area that experiences congestion due to high volumes, but also congestion related to spillback from upstream congestion occurring at the interstate bridge. And so if you look at the solid line, you can see that speeds stay relatively consistent until about the noon hour and then drop off quite a bit through the early evening and don't recover until about 8 p.m. in the evening. In our model data, we show congestion starting to build, but then really coming to a head at the 2 o'clock period and then dissipating by 6 to 7 p.m. So there's a disconnect here in terms of the temporal time frame of congestion that we're measuring, but also in the overall extent of that congestion. As you can see by the solid line is much lower than the dotted line. Next slide, please. So how do we reconcile these differences into something that's meaningful in terms of evaluating how congestion may grow or change into the future? Well, as Joe showed before, it's simply a matter of measuring the deltas that we see from the model and applying those deltas to the observed base year. So in this example, if we look at the base year model, we 3 hours of congestion for segment 1. In the base year, in the future year, that turns into 4 hours. That's a difference of 1 hour. We can take that 1 hour anticipated growth in congestion and add it to the observed base year hours below the speed threshold and come up with a 4.5 hours of forecasted congestion at this location. So we're taking the observed congestion from the RIDIS data, the INRIX data, and we're calculating how much we estimate that congestion to grow over time using the model. And you can just follow the formulas for each one of the segments here in this example. And let's see, is that it, Joe? I guess I'm passing it back to you.
Oh, don't say that's it. That was a lot, but yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, I'll toss it back, and I'll watch the time here. I want to be sure we have some time for Q&A, so I'll just give you some quick hits from some of the initial results of our first time really running this region-wide in the way that Peter just set up there. So you'll kind of see, so on some maps like this, one thing we noted was that there was a reason, like Peter said, we were leaning on the observed probe data for the baseline conditions, because that it's something that's measurable. It's going to likely be more precise than the model, and most of the time. And so one thing we noticed is that there was a lot of agreement, between the model and the observed data, but there were also locations where they really diverged in that baseline estimate, and initially we flagged those, and it was really helpful to do that. Where there was a 4 hour or greater difference in terms of hours under the speed threshold, we kind of we flagged and showed those as these dotted lines you can see. Now in the final policy work or the public facing documents, these we ended up scrapping because it was just, it's confusing to the average person that doesn't even know what the travel model does or any of this stuff Peter just showed you. But it was really useful, and I think things like this are, it's worth seeing where the model really diverges from reality when you have a measurement, and it gives you a much deeper understanding of what's going on. So I will proceed through. So just from the observed probe data, you can see this is its view via this performance measure of Portland's throughway weekday reliability, where you see the colors, the blue or the red. The red is more intense. Both of those, though, are not meeting that policy. They're more than 4 hours a day. That the speed falls below our threshold. The gray roads, which I know are a little hard to see here, are meeting that threshold. Doesn't mean performance is perfect, but as you see, this is doing a better job than that sort of pegged volume to capacity fuel gauge that we had in the past. So it was good to see, it's in range of the measure, the conditions we're actually seeing, which is more useful to policy. This is just a chart version of a system-wide summary. So we also did some system-wide summaries just to understand the measure and conditions, and you can see by scenario a sort of percentage of miles in the regional throughway system that were not meeting that performance criteria, no more than 4 hours a day, where the speeds are falling into that unstable range. And you see it starts at about, I'm going to focus on these orange bars, which are the controlled access facilities. And starting around 20% of the mileage in the regional network is not meeting that criteria. And of course, it grows in the no-build scenarios to a prediction from the combination of model and observed data to around 45% in the 2045 no-build scenario. Nothing's done. That's not already in progress. In the model, in the financially constrained scenario, that last one, which represents our best guess at what investments will take place, you can see, it's sort of holding the line in terms of this performance measure, a little bit pretty close to the baseline conditions. Now, that of course includes things like pricing and many projects, which are never certain, but it was showing us that it's giving us some useful information about how plans and policies are actually impacting the system. So that was good to see. An interesting outcome of this, we looked at facilities that weren't meeting the criteria, and we noticed that there were some consistent patterns among them, and we pulled that out as something to chew on a little bit and to think about from a policy perspective. That we were seeing these two that stood out, these two typologies, and one of them is in the first one where we have a midday and a PM peak congestion pattern. Right? So this represents some facilities, including parts of 217. In this one at the right, we see this all-day congestion pattern. This is a different typology where speeds drop during the AM peak around 6 a.m. and they don't recover until after 6 p.m. After 8 p.m. in the evening. Excuse me. So it really is more than 12 hours a day where the speeds are in that kind of unstable or range. Interesting to think about that from a policy perspective. I'm just going to show you one. So we did these comparisons for all our different RTP scenarios, but this is one of them. So you see the no build on the left, and again, both the blue and the red are showing areas where we're not meeting the threshold. On the right-hand pane, you see the difference with the financially constrained policies in place, including pricing, the interstate bridge replacement project, and some other major projects in the region. And so, this is where it becomes that identification of need. You can see where our policies are making headway on the performance measures and where they are not. And so, those would be areas for further study, including Highway 26 in and out of downtown, Highway 217, and still pieces of 84 and 205. You can also think about it as a delta, from the base year. So this is the 2045 constrained scenario change from our 2020 base. So kind of understanding how conditions are changing relative to those hours per day under the speed threshold, where the blue things are getting better and the red things are getting worse. So sometimes, individual facilities have their own, local phenomena that make it hard to say ever meet the threshold, right? Just because of constraints. But sometimes it's helpful to just focus, I think, on the delta. Is policy pushing it in the right direction, even if we're still not able to meet, where we would like to be. And this final point before I stop and open it up to any thoughts from the room. Like I said, we're feeding this back into, we're putting it on our wish list for model improvements. We're going to look more closely at some of these areas where the model in the base year disagrees with the probe data. Probe data is not perfect either, but it's worth looking into. And so what you're seeing here in each of these quadrants represents the model on the y-axis, hours per day under the threshold, so congestion getting worse, and on the x-axis, the observed hours getting worse. And so in the lower left and the upper right is where the model and the observed data are agreeing, and they're both saying the same thing about giving you an up or down on whether it's meeting the threshold. In the other two, the upper left is where the model is actually predicting more congested conditions than we're observing on the ground. In the lower right, it's the opposite, the maybe more expected one because of what Peter said, where the model's kind of under predicting congestion on particular segments, and all of those that are not filled in are places we flagged to go back to later and try to understand what is it about local conditions, model limitations that's causing us to kind of miss more than we would expect versus the closest thing we have to a sort of ground truth. So that's kind of where we are. I glossed over a little bit. Another thing we are looking at is we'll probably revisit those signalized facilities. It's tough to define a one-size-fits-all metric because they're so unique, an urban arterial in different locations in the region. And as some of you with sharp eyes probably notice, most of them were meeting the criteria most of the time. That criteria is pretty low, 20 miles per hour average speed. So that's what we're working on with this. I think we were pleased with how it came out. We learned a lot from it, and I think it gives the planners and policymakers at Metro a new tool in their toolkit that's a lot more nuanced than the old volume to capacity ratios. I also want to take a moment to thank Kim Ellis at Metro, instrumental in this entire process, which we were a small part of, and also Glenn Bolin at ODOT Region 1, who really worked closely with us to refine and develop this methodology. So, and thanks all for your time. I hope some of this was useful to your thinking about your modeling your regions.
So I know that we're over time, Liming, but Joe, I'm just wondering, could you go real quick and show the no build versus the constrained? Because there's a lot of questions in the chat regarding pricing, tolling, and whatnot. And I just want to emphasize that essentially this no build versus the constrained is a comparison of a price, no price scenario. Far and away, the RMPP is the most significant project in the RMPP or in the RTP in terms of its impact on traffic. And so if you just look at the no build versus the constrained comparisons here, you can see the impact that pricing is having in terms of congestion management on I-5 and I-205. IBR and the I-205 Abernathy Bridge replacement both have tolls as well, but those impacts are more local. RMPP is a much more regional scale, and so that accounts for virtually all the change you see here in this comparison.
Sorry, you're seeing this presenter via Teams is not letting me share the bigger screen, but yeah.
Great, thanks for the clarification. I think there is few back and forth in the chat for those that haven't paid attention. It's basically what's included in the no build versus the constraint scenario. So since we are right on time, certainly feel free to still chat all those questions. I'll probably move on.